The Silver Screen Theater loomed like a forgotten ghost on the edge of town, its neon sign flickering weakly against the bruised purple sky. I stood outside the glass doors, my breath fogging in the October chill, clutching a crumpled want ad I'd torn from the local paper. Nightshift cleaner needed. $12 per hour. No experience required. I was 19, drowning in student loan notices, and this was my last shot before eviction. The building looked like it hadn't been touched since Eisenhower was president, faded red awnings, chipped gold paint curling off the marquee, and a faint smell of mildew that hit me before I even stepped inside. The sign above read Silver Screen, though half the letters were dark, making it look like S ver Scene. I shifted my backpack, heavy with a water bottle and a half-eaten granola bar, and pushed the door open. Inside, the lobby was a time capsule. Red velvet curtains sagged from brass rods, their edges frayed like old bandages. The carpet was a worn burgundy, stained with decades of spilled soda and popcorn grease. A lone chandelier hung above, its bulbs dim and buzzing, casting jagged shadows across the ticket booth. The air was thick, stale, with a sour undertone, like something wet had been left to rot behind the walls. I glanced at my phone, 10:45 p.m. 15 minutes until my shift started. The last show, some low-budget zombie flick called Blood Rot, was still playing, its muffled screams leaking through the heavy oak doors of the auditorium. I adjusted my hoodie, the zipper catching on a loose thread, and scanned the lobby for the manager. Nobody. Just a flickering fluorescent light above the candy counter, where glass jars held stale licorice and gummy worms dusted with age. My sneakers squeaked on the sticky floor as I stepped toward the counter, spotting a bell with a sign, "Ring for service." I hesitated, then tapped it. The chime was shrill, cutting through the silence like a knife. A moment later, a door behind the counter creaked open, and out stepped Mr. Hargrove. He was older than I expected, maybe 60, with a face like crumpled parchment, deep lines carved around his mouth and eyes, which were small and gray, darting like he was expecting trouble. His gray hair was slicked back, thinning at the crown, and he wore a faded black suit that hung loose on his wiry frame. "You Elliot?" he asked, his voice low, like he didn't want to disturb the air. "Yeah," I said, shifting my weight. "Here for the night shift." He nodded, not smiling, and handed me a flashlight, its plastic cracked but the beam strong when I tested it. "You'll need this," he said, then reached under the counter and pulled out a ring of keys, heavy with at least a dozen, all rusted and mismatched. "These open everything: lobby, restrooms, projection booth. Don't lose, M." His eyes flicked to the auditorium doors, then back to me. "Last show ends at midnight. You lock up at 4 a.m. sharp. No earlier, no later." "Got it," I said, pocketing the keys. They jingled, cold against my thigh. He hesitated, then slid a folded piece of paper across the counter. "Rules," he said, his voice dropping lower. "Read, M. Follow, M. Don't ask questions." His gaze held mine, unblinking, and for a second, I thought I saw fear in his eyes. Not annoyance or impatience, fear, raw and sharp. Before I could respond, he turned and disappeared through the door, leaving me alone with the hum of the chandelier and the distant sound of zombie screams. I unfolded the paper. It was yellowed, the edges curling like it had been handled 1,000 times. The handwriting was shaky, written in black ink that had smudged in places, as if the writer's hand was trembling. At the top, in all caps, it read, "Silver Screen Night Shift Rules." Below were 6 lines, each more bizarre than the last. Keep the projector running on a blank reel after the last show. Never turn it off. If you hear footsteps in the auditorium, stay in the lobby. Do not look inside. At 2 a.m. Check the restroom mirrors. If your reflection moves differently, leave immediately and don't turn around. Do not open the projection booth door between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m., no matter what you hear. If the auditorium doors open on their own, play the reel labeled SS 1947 in the emergency kit. Never speak to anyone in the theater after midnight. They are not patrons. I read it twice, my eyebrows climbing. A prank, I figured. Some kind of hazing for the new guy. I'd worked at a gas station where the night crew left fake robbery notes to mess with me, so this wasn't new. Still, the rules were weirdly specific, and Hargrove's expression hadn't screamed joking. I stuffed the paper in my pocket, next to the keys, and checked my phone again, 10:55 p.m. 5 minutes until my official start. I wandered to the employee locker room, a cramped space behind the ticket booth with a single flickering bulb and a row of rusted lockers. Mine was number 13, naturally. The door squeaked as I opened it, revealing a crumpled note taped inside, written in the same shaky cursive as the rules: follow the rules, or it fines you. My stomach twisted, just a little. Not because I believed it, come on, I wasn't that gullible, but because the note looked old, the tape brittle and yellowed, like it had been there for years. I tore it down, crumpled it into a ball, and tossed it in the trash can by the door. Prank or not, I wasn't here to play games. I had rent to pay. I stashed my backpack in the locker, keeping my water bottle and granola bar out, and grabbed the broom leaning against the wall. The lobby needed sweeping, and I figured I'd start there to kill time until the movie ended. The carpet crunched under my feet, littered with popcorn kernels and candy wrappers. As I swept, the chandelier flickered again, throwing shadows that danced across the walls like figures ducking out of sight. I shook it off. Old wiring, old building. Nothing more. At 11:30, the auditorium doors creaked open, and the first patrons trickled out, a couple of teens, giggling and shoving each other, and an old man in a frayed coat, his eyes glassy as he shuffled past without a word. I nodded at them, but they didn't acknowledge me, just pushed through the glass doors into the night. The zombie flick soundtrack still played, all groans and splattering blood, but it was winding down. I checked the rules again, my thumb brushing the smudged ink. Keep the projector running. Fine. I'd figure out where the projection booth was after the last stragglers left. By 11:50, the lobby was empty, the soundtrack silent. I locked the front doors, the keys heavy in my hand, and turned back to the lobby. The air felt different now, thicker, like it was pressing against my skin. The chandelier's buzz was louder, almost a hum, and the shadows seemed sharper, longer. I gripped the flashlight, its beam cutting through the dimness, and headed for the counter to grab the cleaning supplies. That's when I heard it. A faint tap, like a single fingernail against wood, coming from the auditorium. I froze, my heart kicking up a notch. Just the building settling, I told myself. Old places creak. But the tap came again, slow and deliberate, like someone was testing the floorboards. I glanced at the rules in my pocket, half pulled out. If you hear footsteps in the auditorium, stay in the lobby. It wasn't footsteps, not exactly, but it was close enough to make my skin prickle. I stayed put, shining the flashlight across the lobby, its beam catching the edge of the auditorium doors. They were closed, locked, just like they should be. The tapping stopped, and for a moment, the only sound was my own breathing, quick and shallow. I forced a laugh, shaking my head. Get it together, Elliot, I muttered, turning back to the counter. But as I reached for the cleaning spray, the tapping started again, louder, closer, like boots on hardwood, pacing just beyond the auditorium doors. My hand froze mid-air. The rule said not to look, but every instinct screamed to check, to prove it was nothing. I gripped the flashlight tighter, my knuckles white, and stayed in the lobby, my eyes locked on the counter's glass surface, where my reflection stared back, pale and wide-eyed. The tapping didn't stop. It grew rhythmic, purposeful, like whatever was making it knew I was listening. The tapping from the auditorium didn't stop. It echoed in the silver screen's cavernous lobby, each sharp tap like a hammer against my skull. I stood frozen behind the candy counter, flashlight clutched in one sweaty hand, the other gripping the edge of the counter so hard my fingers ached. The beam of light trembled as I aimed it at the auditorium doors, two heavy oak slabs, carved with faded Art Deco swirls, locked tight after the last patrons shuffled out. The sound wasn't footsteps, not exactly, but it was close, deliberate, like someone or something was pacing just beyond the threshold, testing the silence. I glanced at the crumpled rules in my pocket, the shaky cursive of Rule 2 burning in my mind: if you hear footsteps in the auditorium, stay in the lobby. Do not look inside. My heart thudded, loud enough I swore it could be heard over the chandelier's buzz. The silver screen theater was a rotting monument to a bygone era. The lobby's burgundy carpet was threadbare, patched with dark stains that no amount of cleaning could lift. The walls, once a rich cream, were yellowed, streaked with water damage that looked like claw marks in the dim light. The chandelier above flickered, its bulbs casting jagged shadows that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking, like figures darting just out of sight. The air was thick with the stench of stale popcorn, burnt sugar from the candy counter, and that sour, wet rot that clung to everything. It was the kind of place that made you feel watched, even when you were alone. Or thought you were. I checked my phone, 12:05 a.m. The last show of Blood Rot had ended 5 minutes ago, the final patrons, a couple of snickering teens and that creepy old man in the frayed coat, long gone. The glass front doors were locked, the keys heavy in my pocket, their jagged edges digging into my thigh. I'd swept half the lobby, leaving a pile of popcorn kernels and candy wrappers by the ticket booth, but the tapping had stopped me cold. It wasn't just the sound, it was the rhythm, slow and purposeful, like whatever was making it knew I was listening, knew I was alone. I forced myself to move, grabbing the cleaning spray from under the counter. The bottle was sticky, its label peeling, and the nozzle sputtered when I tested it, spitting a weak mist of lemon-scented chemicals. I sprayed the candy counter's glass, wiping it with a rag that smelled faintly of mold. The reflection showed my face, pale, eyes too wide, my dark hair sticking to my forehead with sweat. I looked like I'd seen a ghost, and I hadn't even been here an hour. It's just an old building, I muttered, my voice swallowed by the lobby's oppressive quiet. Old buildings creak. Pipes groan. Nothing more. But the tapping didn't agree. It came again, sharper now, like a nail driven into wood, then another, and another, building into a steady cadence. Tap. 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 I stopped wiping, the rag dangling from my hand. The sound was closer, maybe 10 feet beyond the auditorium doors, right where the first rows of seats would be. I pictured the auditorium, rows of sagging velvet chairs, the screen looming like a blank eye, the projector's light flickering through the booth's window upstairs. I hadn't been in there yet, but Hargrove had pointed it out during my 5-minute orientation, his bony finger jabbing toward the heavy doors. "Stay out unless you're loading a reel," he'd said, his voice clipped, like he didn't want to linger on the topic. I stepped back from the counter, my sneakers sticking to the carpet. The flashlight's beam swept across the lobby, catching the ticket booth's cracked glass, the faded posters for movie. Nobody remembered, The Shadows Call, Whispers in the Dark, their titles in garish red cursive. The beam lingered on the auditorium doors, the gap beneath them black as ink. The tapping stopped, sudden as a held breath, and the silence was worse. It pressed against my ears, thick and heavy, like the air itself was waiting for something to happen. I pulled the rules from my pocket, smoothing the paper against the counter. The ink was smudged in places, the words uneven, like whoever wrote them was in a hurry. Keep the projector running on a blank reel after the last show. Never turn it off. I frowned. The projector was still humming upstairs, its light casting a faint, flickering glow through the booth's window, high above the lobby. I hadn't touched it, hadn't even gone near the booth yet. Hargrove had shown me the stairs, narrow, creaking, tucked behind a curtain near the restrooms, but I'd stayed in the lobby, sticking to the cleaning tasks. The projector's hum was steady, almost comforting, until I noticed the flicker. It wasn't regular, like a bulb about to die. It was erratic, like something was moving in front of the lens, breaking the light. I shook my head, shoving the rules back in my pocket. "Stupid prank," I muttered, but my voice cracked, betraying me. I grabbed the broom again, determined to ignore the tapping, the flicker, the creeping dread that made my skin itch. I swept the lobby's far corner, near the restrooms, where the carpet was darkest, the stains almost black. The broom bristles caught on something sticky, and I bent down, shining the flashlight. A smear of something red, ketchup, maybe, or spilled soda, glistened under the light. I scrubbed at it with the rag, but it didn't budge, only spread, leaving a faint coppery smell. I straightened, my stomach twisting. Not ketchup. The tapping started again, louder, closer, like boots on the auditorium's hardwood stage. Tap. 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 I backed away from the restroom hallway, my flashlight beam shaking as it swept the lobby. The chandelier flickered, plunging the room into half-darkness for a split second before buzzing back to life. The shadows seemed to move, stretching toward the auditorium doors like fingers. I gripped the broom handle, my knuckles white, and forced myself to stay put. Rule 2, do not look inside. But the urge to peek, to prove it was nothing, was overwhelming. Just a quick glance, I thought. Just to shut up the part of my brain screaming that something was wrong. I took a step toward the doors, then stopped. The tapping shifted, no longer random, it was a pattern, like a code, pausing and starting in bursts. Tap tap. Pause. Tap tap tap. My breath caught. It sounded like it was right behind the doors now, inches away. I backed up, my heel catching on the carpet, and stumbled into the candy counter, knocking over a jar of licorice. It hit the floor with a dull thud, black ropes spilling across the carpet like snakes. I cursed under my breath, crouching to scoop them up, my hands shaking so badly I dropped half of them. The projector's hum faltered, just for a second, and the light from the booth dimmed, then flared brighter, casting a stark white glow across the lobby. I froze, licorice in my hands, and looked up. The booth's window was small, high above the auditorium doors, but the light was wrong, too bright, too sharp, like a spotlight searching for something. Or someone. I stood slowly, my eyes locked on the window, waiting for movement, for a shadow to pass in front of the lens. Nothing. Just the hum, steady again, and the tapping, now so loud it vibrated in my chest. I checked my phone, 12:30 a.m. I'd been here less than an hour, and already the silver screen felt like a trap. The rules weren't a prank. I knew it in my gut, the way you know a storm's coming before the first raindrop falls. I set the licorice jar back on the counter, my hands leaving sweaty smears on the glass, and grabbed the cleaning spray again. Keep moving, I told myself. Keep busy. Don't think about the tapping, the light, the rules. I sprayed the counter, wiping in tight circles, my reflection distorted in the streaked glass. My eyes looked hollow, my mouth a thin line. I didn't recognize myself. The tapping stopped. The silence was worse, heavy and expectant, like the moment before a scream. I gripped the flashlight, its beam cutting through the lobby, and forced myself to focus on the task. Clean the counter. Sweep the floor. Lock up at 4 a.m. I could do this. I had to. But as I wiped the last streak from the glass, a new sound started, a faint creak, slow and deliberate, coming from the auditorium doors. My head snapped up. The doors were still closed, still locked, but the creak grew louder, like wood bending under pressure. I backed away, my heart pounding so hard I felt it in my throat. Rule 5, if the auditorium doors open on their own, play the reel labeled SS 1947 in the emergency kit. I fumbled under the counter, my hands shaking as I pulled out the rusted metal box Hargrove had pointed to during orientation. The emergency kit. I pried it open, the hinges squealing, and found a single film reel inside, its label faded but legible, SS, 1947. The reel was heavy, cold, the metal dented like it had been dropped 100 times. I clutched it, my eyes darting to the auditorium doors. They hadn't moved, but the creaking continued, low and menacing, like a warning. I didn't want to go to the projection booth. The stairs were dark, narrow, and the rules, Rule 4, said not to open the booth door between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m. It wasn't 1 yet, but the thought of climbing those stairs, of being alone in that cramped booth with the tapping and the creaking, made my skin crawl. I set the reel on the counter, my hands trembling, and checked my phone again, 12:45 a.m. The night was crawling, each minute stretching longer than the last. The chandelier buzzed, flickered, buzzed again. The projector's hum was steady, but the light still flickered, casting shadows that didn't match the room's angles. I grabbed the broom, needing something to do, and swept the lobby's far corner, near the faded posters. The title seemed to mock me, Whispers in the Dark, The Shadows Call. I wondered if whoever named those films had worked here, had heard the tapping, had followed the rules. The creaking stopped, but the tapping started again, faster now, like a countdown. Tap tap tap. Pause. Tap tap. I gripped the broom, my nails digging into the wood, and stayed in the lobby, my back to the wall. The flashlight beam shook as I aimed it at the auditorium doors, half expecting them to burst open. They didn't. But the tapping didn't stop, and the projector's light flickered again, a shadow passing in front of it, quick and gone. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination, but the note from my locker burned in my mind, follow the rules, or it finds you. The tapping didn't let up. It drilled into my skull, a relentless tap-tap-tap that seemed to come from every corner of the Silver Screen's auditorium, just beyond the heavy oak doors. I stood in the lobby, back pressed against the candy counter, the flashlight's beam shaking in my hand as it cut through the dimness. The light caught the auditorium doors' carved swirls, their shadows twisting like veins under the flickering chandelier. The air was thick, heavy with the sour rot that clung to the theater's walls, now mixed with a faint metallic tang that made my stomach churn. My phone read 12:50 a.m., barely an hour into my first night shift, and already the Silver Screen felt like a cage. The rules were stuffed in my pocket, the paper creased and damp from my sweaty hands. I didn't need to pull them out to remember Rule 2, if you hear footsteps in the auditorium, stay in the lobby. Do not look inside. The tapping wasn't footsteps, not exactly, but it was close. Sharp, deliberate, like someone was striking the auditorium's hardwood floor with a hammer. Or a boot. Or something worse. I gripped the flashlight tighter, its cracked plastic digging into my palm, and tried to focus on the lobby, on the mundane tasks I was hired to do. Clean the counter. Sweep the floor. Lock up at 4 a.m. But the tapping made it impossible to think, each sound a needle in my nerves. The lobby was a tomb of faded grandeur. The burgundy carpet crunched under my sneakers, littered with popcorn kernels and sticky candy wrappers from the last show of blood rot. The candy counter's glass was streaked with years of fingerprints, reflecting my pale face, eyes too wide, mouth tight, sweat beading on my forehead despite the October chill seeping through the glass front doors. The chandelier buzzed overhead, its light flickering, casting shadows that seemed to move when I blinked, like figures slipping just out of sight. The projector's hum from the booth upstairs was steady, but its light flickered too, erratically, like something was passing in front of the lens. I hadn't gone up there yet. Hadn't dared, not after Hargrove's warning and the rule's insistence on keeping the projector running. I set the SS 1947 reel back in the emergency kit, its weight still cold in my hands, and slammed the rusted box shut. The creaking from the auditorium doors had stopped, but the tapping was louder now, faster, a rhythm that felt like it was mocking me. Tap tap. Pause. Tap tap tap. I grabbed the broom again, needing something to do, and swept the lobby's far corner, near the restroom hallway. The carpet was darkest here, the stains almost black, like dried blood. I avoided looking at the smear I'd found earlier, the one that smelled of copper, and focused on the broom's bristles, scraping against the floor. The tapping kept pace, matching my movements, like whatever was making it was watching. I stopped sweeping, my breath shallow, and aimed the flashlight at the auditorium doors. The gap beneath them was black, no light leaking through, but the tapping seemed to come from right there, inches away. I took a step back, my heel catching on a candy wrapper, and stumbled, the broom clattering to the floor. The sound echoed, too loud in the silent lobby, and the tapping paused, as if startled. My heart pounded, blood roaring in my ears. I waited, frozen, expecting the tapping to start again, but for a moment, there was nothing, just the projector's hum and the chandelier's buzz, battling for dominance in the oppressive quiet. Then it came again, slower, heavier, like a boot dragging across wood. Tap. Drag. Tap. My mouth went dry. I snatched the broom from the floor, clutching it like a weapon, and backed toward the candy counter. The flashlight's beam swept the lobby, catching the faded posters on the walls, the shadows call, whispers in the dark, their titles in blood-red cursive, the faces of long-forgotten actors staring blankly. The projector's light flickered again, the booth's window high above the auditorium doors flaring bright, then dim, then bright again. I squinted, trying to see if something moved up there, a shadow or a shape, but the glass was too small, too far. I checked my phone, 12:55 a.m. The night was dragging, each second heavier than the last. The rules weighed in my pocket, their words looping in my head. Stay in the lobby. Do not look inside. But the tapping was relentless, shifting now, no longer just at the doors but spreading, like it was circling the auditorium, moving along the walls. Tap tap. Drag. Tap. I pictured the auditorium's interior, rows of sagging velvet seats, the screen a blank canvas, the stage where the tapping seemed loudest, its hardwood worn but solid. I'd never been inside, but I could imagine it, could feel it, like the theater was pressing its layout into my mind. I set the broom against the counter and grabbed the cleaning spray, needing to move, to do something normal. The bottle's nozzle sputtered, spitting lemon-scented mist that did nothing to mask the theater's rot. I wiped the counter's glass, my reflection distorted, my eyes hollow. The tapping shifted again, faster, like a code I couldn't crack. Tap tap tap. Pause. Tap. I stopped wiping, the rag dangling, and listened. It was closer now, right at the doors, the sound vibrating through the oak. I backed up, my sneakers squeaking, and bumped into the emergency kit, the SS 1947 reel rattling inside. The chandelier flickered, plunging the lobby into darkness for a split second before buzzing back to life. The shadows stretched, claw-like, toward the auditorium doors. I gripped the flashlight, its beam shaking as I aimed it at the gap beneath the doors. Nothing. Just darkness. But the tapping didn't stop, and now there was a new sound, a faint scrape, like nails on wood, joining the rhythm. Tap. Scrape. Tap tap. My skin crawled. I wanted to run, to grab my backpack from the locker and bolt through the front doors, but the note from my locker burned in my mind, follow the rules, or it finds you. I pulled the rules from my pocket, my hands trembling so badly the paper nearly tore. The ink was smudged, the cursive shaky, but the words were clear. Keep the projector running. Stay in the lobby. Don't look inside. I stuffed the paper back, my fingers brushing the keys, their jagged edges a small comfort. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, like it was trying to get my attention. I forced myself to move, to focus on the lobby, on the job. I sprayed the counter again, wiping in tight circles, but my eyes kept darting to the auditorium doors, to the gap where the tapping seemed to live. The projector's hum faltered, just for a moment, and the booth's light dimmed, then flared red, pulsing like a heartbeat. My breath caught. Rule 1, never turn it off. I hadn't touched it, hadn't even been near the booth, but the light was wrong, too bright, too alive. I stepped toward the curtain hiding the stairs to the booth, then stopped. Rule 4. Do not open the projection booth door between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m. It wasn't 1 yet, but the thought of climbing those narrow stairs, of being alone in that cramped room with the tapping and the red light, made my chest tighten. The tapping stopped. The silence was worse, thick and heavy, like the theater was holding its breath. I stood in the lobby, flashlight aimed at the doors, waiting for the next sound, the next sign. The chandelier buzzed, flickered, buzzed again. The projector's hum steadied, but the red light pulsed, casting shadows that didn't belong. I checked my phone, 1 a.m. The tapping started again, slower, heavier, like a warning. Tap. Drag. Tap. I backed against the counter, my heart pounding, and knew I wasn't alone. The tapping morphed into something heavier, a deliberate thud-thud that shook the auditorium doors, as if whatever was behind them was testing their strength. I stood frozen in the silver screen's lobby, my back pressed against the candy counter, the flashlight's beam trembling across the oak door's carved swirls. The chandelier buzzed. Overhead, its flickering light casting shadows that twisted like fingers reaching for the gap beneath the doors, where darkness seemed to pulse. The air was thick, sour with mildew and that metallic tang that clung to my throat, making every breath feel like swallowing rust. My phone read 1:05 a.m., and the rules in my pocket felt like a lead weight, their words screaming in my head: if the auditorium doors open on their own, play the reel labeled SS 1947 in the emergency kit. The silver screen was a decaying beast, its lobby a graveyard of faded opulence. The burgundy carpet was sticky under my sneakers, littered with popcorn kernels and candy wrappers from the last blood-rot screening. The walls, once cream, were streaked with water damage, the stains curling like claw marks in the dim light. The candy counter's glass reflected my face, pale, sweaty, eyes wide like a cornered animal. The projector's hum from the booth upstairs was steady, but its light, now a sickly red, pulsed through the booth's small window, high above the auditorium doors. It wasn't supposed to be red. Rule 1, keep the projector running on a blank reel. Never turn it off. I hadn't touched it, but the light's pulse felt alive, like it was watching me. The thud-thud grew louder, joined by a low creak, like wood bending under pressure. The auditorium doors, locked tight after the last patrons left, shivered in their frame. I clutched the flashlight, its cracked plastic cutting into my palm, and swept the beam across the lobby, catching the faded posters, The Shadows Call, Whispers in the Dark, their red cursive titles glowing like fresh blood. The creaking intensified, a slow groan that made my teeth ache, and then, with a soft click, the doors parted, just an inch, revealing a sliver of black beyond. My heart stopped. Rule 5. I lunged for the emergency kit under the counter, my hands shaking so badly I nearly knocked it to the floor. The rusted box squealed as I pried it open, revealing the SS 1947 reel, its metal cold and dented, the label faded but legible. I grabbed it, my fingers slipping on the smooth surface, and sprinted toward the curtain hiding the stairs to the projection booth. The rules flashed in my mind. Rule 4, do not open the projection booth door between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m., but it was barely past 1, and the doors were opening, so I had no choice. The creaking grew louder, the gap widening, and a cold draft spilled out, carrying a smell like wet earth and copper. The stairs were narrow, tucked behind a heavy velvet curtain near the restroom hallway. My sneakers thudded on the creaking wood, each step echoing in the tight space. The flashlight beam bounced, catching cobwebs and peeling paint on the walls. The projector's hum was louder here, vibrating through the floor, but the red light pulsed faster, like a heartbeat gone wild. I reached the booth door, a rusted metal slab with a small, grimy window. The knob was ice cold, stinging my hand, but it turned. I pushed the door open, the hinges screaming, and stepped inside. The booth was a claustrophobic box, barely big enough for the projector, a stool, and a shelf crammed with dusty film cans. The projector itself was ancient, its metal casing dented, the lens glowing red, casting a crimson haze across the room. The blank reel spun, its clicks drowned by the hum, but the light was wrong, unnatural, like it was bleeding. I fumbled with the SS 1947 reel, my hands slick with sweat, and tried to swap it out. The projector's mechanism was a tangle of gears and levers, nothing like the YouTube tutorials I'd watched for modern machines. My fingers slipped, the reel clattering against the floor, and the tapping from the auditorium below turned into a heavy thud-thud-thud, shaking the walls. I cursed, grabbing the reel and forcing it onto the projector's spindle. The machine groaned as I threaded the film, the red light flickering, casting my shadow across the booth's walls. Too tall, too thin, not quite mine. I froze, my breath hitching, but didn't look back. The rules didn't say anything about shadows, but I wasn't taking chances. The reel clicked into place, and I hit the switch. The projector whirred, the red light fading to a grainy white as the SS 1947 reel began to play. A low, distorted hum filled the booth, like static mixed with a distant scream, and the screen downstairs lit up with flickering black and white images. I didn't look. Rule 5 didn't say to watch, just to play it. I backed out of the booth, slamming the door shut, the sound swallowed by the hum. The stairs creaked as I descended, my flashlight beam shaking across the curtain. The tapping had stopped, but the creaking hadn't, the auditorium doors were still ajar, the gap now wide enough to see the first row of seats, their velvet faded to gray. I reached the lobby, my heart pounding, and stayed near the counter, far from the doors. The projector's hum was louder now, the distorted sound vibrating through the floor, making my teeth ache. I checked my phone, 1:15 a.m. The night was crawling, each minute a lifetime. The chandelier flickered, plunging the lobby into darkness for a split second before buzzing back to life. The shadows stretched, claw-like, toward the auditorium doors, where the gap seemed wider, blacker. The air was colder, the wet earth smell stronger, curling in my lungs. I gripped the flashlight, its beam cutting through the dimness, and swept it across the lobby, catching the candy counter's glass, the faded posters, the emergency kit still open on the counter. The SS 1947 reel was playing, but the creaking didn't stop, and now there was a new sound, a faint, wet scrape, like something heavy being dragged across the auditorium stage. I backed against the counter, my sneakers sticking to the carpet, and tried to focus on the rules. Stay in the lobby. Don't look inside. But the doors were open, and the scrape was growing louder, closer, like it was moving toward the gap. I wanted to run, to grab my backpack from the locker and sprint through the front doors, but the note from my locker burned in my mind, follow the rules, or it finds you. I checked my phone again, 1:20 a.m. The projector's hum faltered, the light flickering, and the scrape became a slow, deliberate drag, like a body being pulled across the floor. My mouth went dry. I clutched the flashlight, my eyes locked on the auditorium doors, and prayed the reel would do whatever it was supposed to do before whatever was behind those doors came through. The wet, dragging sound slithered through the silver screen's lobby, a slow drag that seemed to claw its way from the auditorium's open doors. I stood behind the candy counter, my back pressed against the sticky glass, the flashlight's beam trembling across the oak door's widening gap. The SS 1947 reel hummed from the projection booth upstairs, its distorted static filling the air like a warped lullaby, but it wasn't enough to drown out the dragging, now so close I could almost feel it vibrating through the carpet. My phone read 1:25 a.m., and the rules in my pocket felt like a curse, their shaky cursive burned into my mind. If the auditorium doors open on their own, play the reel labeled SS 1947 in the emergency kit. I'd done that, but the doors were still ajar, the gap now wide enough to show the auditorium's first row of faded velvet seats, swallowed by darkness. The lobby was a decaying shrine, its burgundy carpet crunching under my sneakers, littered with popcorn kernels and candy wrappers from the blood-rot screening. The walls, streaked with water damage, seemed to pulse in the chandelier's flickering light, the stains curling like veins. The air was thick, sour with mildew and that metallic tang that coated my tongue, now mixed with a new smell. Wet earth, like an open grave. The candy counter's glass reflected my face, pale, eyes hollow, sweat dripping down my temples despite the cold seeping through the locked front doors. The projector's light, no longer red but a grainy white, flickered through the booth's window high above, casting shadows that didn't match the room's angles. I gripped the flashlight, its cracked plastic biting into my palm, and kept my eyes on the auditorium doors. The gap was maybe 6 inches now, the darkness beyond it thick, almost solid, like it could reach out and grab me. The dragging sound grew louder, deliberate, drag, like a heavy sack being pulled across the auditorium's hardwood stage. I wanted to slam the doors shut, to lock them and run, but Rule 2 echoed in my head, stay in the lobby. Do not look inside. My heart pounded, blood roaring in my ears, and I forced myself to focus on the counter, on the open emergency kit, its rusted lid glinting under the chandelier's buzz. The SS 1947 reel's hum was steady, but the distorted sound it produced, a low, garbled drone like voices trapped in static, made my skin crawl. I hadn't looked at the screen. When I loaded the reel, hadn't dared, but the sound alone was wrong, like it was pulling something out of the air. The dragging stopped for a moment, replaced by a faint scrape, like nails on wood, slow and deliberate. I froze, my breath shallow, and swept the flashlight's beam across the lobby, catching the faded posters, the shadows call, whispers in the dark, their red cursive titles glowing like embers. The chandelier flickered, plunging the room into darkness for a split second before buzzing back to life, the shadows stretching toward the auditorium doors like claws. I checked my phone, 1:30 a.m. The night was a slow bleed, each minute heavier than the last. The rules weighed in my pocket, their words looping in my mind. Keep the projector running. Stay in the lobby. Don't look inside. But the doors were open, and the scraping was closer, now mixed with a faint, wet slosh, like something soaked was being dragged. I pictured the auditorium. Rows of sagging seats, the screen glowing with the reel's grainy static, the stage where the sound seemed to live. I hadn't been inside, but Hargrove's warning and the rule's cryptic instructions painted a picture I couldn't shake. I grabbed the cleaning spray from the counter, needing something normal to anchor me. The bottle's nozzle sputtered, spitting lemon-scented mist that did nothing to mask the theater's rot. I wiped the counter's glass, my reflection distorted, my eyes like black holes. The scraping grew louder, scrape slosh, right at the doors now, like whatever was making it was pressing against the gap. I stopped wiping, the rag dangling, and backed up, my sneakers sticking to the carpet. The flashlight's beam shook as I aimed it at the doors, the gap now wide enough to see the edge of the stage, its hardwood glinting faintly under the reel's flickering light. The projector's hum faltered, the booth's window dimming, then flaring brighter, the grainy white light pulsing like a dying star. My stomach twisted. Rule 1, never turn it off. I hadn't touched it, but the light's flicker felt alive, like it was responding to the dragging, to the doors. I glanced at the stairs to the booth, hidden behind the velvet curtain near the restroom hallway. Rule 4, do not open the projection booth door between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m. It was past 1 now, and the thought of going back up there, of facing that red light again, made my chest tighten. But the doors were open, and the reel wasn't stopping whatever was coming. The scraping stopped, replaced by a low creak, like the doors were being pushed wider. I backed against the counter, the emergency kit rattling as my hip bumped it. The air was colder now, the wet earth smell stronger, curling in my lungs like smoke. I gripped the flashlight, its beam cutting through the dimness, and swept it across the lobby, catching the ticket booth's cracked glass, the faded posters, the chandelier's flickering bulbs. The creaking grew louder, the gap widening to nearly a foot, and a shadow moved in the darkness beyond, a flicker, quick and gone, like something had darted across the stage. I wanted to run, to grab my backpack from the locker and sprint through the front doors, but the note from my locker burned in my mind: follow the rules, or it finds you. I checked my phone again, 1:40 a.m. The dragging started again, drag slosh, slower, heavier, like it was savoring the approach. The chandelier buzzed, flickered, buzzed again, the shadows twisting like they were alive. I clutched the flashlight, my knuckles white, and stayed in the lobby, my eyes locked on the auditorium doors, praying the reel would hold whatever was behind them. But the scraping returned, sharper, scrape, and the gap widened, the darkness spilling out like ink, and I knew the rules weren't enough. The auditorium doors stood ajar, their gap now a foot wide, spilling a darkness so thick it seemed to swallow the silver screen's lobby light. The wet, dragging sound, drag slosh, crawled from the gap, slow and deliberate, like something heavy and soaked was inching closer to the threshold. I stood behind the candy counter, my back pressed against the sticky glass, flashlight aboon to mono, the flashlight's beam shaking in my trembling hand. The SS 1947 reel's distorted hum droned from the projection booth upstairs, its grainy light flickering through the booth's window, casting eerie shadows across the lobby. My phone read 1:50 a.m., and the rules in my pocket felt like a death sentence, their shaky cursive searing my mind. At 2 a.m., check the restroom mirrors. If your reflection moves differently, leave immediately and don't turn around. The lobby was a decaying crypt, its burgundy carpet sticky with years of spilled soda and popcorn grease. The walls, streaked with water damage, seemed to pulse under the chandelier's flickering glow, the stains twisting like veins in the dimness. The air was thick with mildew, wet earth, and that sharp metallic tang that made my stomach churn, now so strong it coated my throat. The candy counter's glass reflected my pale, sweaty face, eyes wide, jaw tight, my dark hair plastered to my forehead. The projector's light pulsed erratically, no longer just grainy white but tinged with that unnatural red again, like blood seeping through the booth's window. The dragging sound grew louder, drag slosh, now mixed with a faint, rhythmic scrape, like nails clawing wood. It was right at the auditorium doors, inches from the gap, where the darkness seemed to writhe. I gripped the flashlight, its cracked plastic cutting into my palm, and swept the beam across the lobby, catching the faded posters, the shadows call, whispers in the dark, their red cursive titles glowing like fresh wounds. The chandelier buzzed, flickered, plunged the room into darkness for a heartbeat, then buzzed back to life, its shadows stretching toward the doors like skeletal hands. I checked my phone, 1:55 a.m. 5 minutes until the mirror check. The rules had been specific, clinical, but the thought of walking down the restroom hallway, of facing those cloudy mirrors, made my legs feel like jelly. The dragging sound paused, then started again, slower, drag slosh, like it was savoring the moment. I clutched the counter's edge, my knuckles white, and tried to focus on the rules, on the job, on anything but the sound. Clean the lobby. Lock up at 4 a.m. Survive. But the auditorium doors creaked wider, the gap now wide enough to see the edge of the stage, its hardwood glinting under the reel's flickering light. I forced myself to move, grabbing the flashlight and stepping toward the restroom hallway. The rule said 2 a.m., but I couldn't wait, couldn't stand there listening to that drag slosh any longer. The hallway was narrow, its fluorescent lights buzzing like dying wasps, one flickering so badly it threw jagged shadows across the peeling wallpaper. The men's room door was heavy, its hinges groaning as I pushed it open. The air inside was colder, sharp with bleach and that same wet earth smell from the auditorium. The mirror was old, clouded with age, its edges chipped. I stepped closer, my sneakers squeaking on the tiles, and stared at my reflection. It was me, pale, sweaty, eyes like black holes, but it was still, normal, matching my every move. I exhaled, my breath fogging the glass, and backed out, letting the door swing shut. The women's room was next, just across the hall. My hand shook as I pushed the door open, the hinges creaking louder than the men's. The air was colder here, the bleach smell stronger, almost choking. The mirror was identical to the men's, but as I stepped closer, my reflection blurred, like a smudge on the glass. I froze, my heart slamming against my ribs. The reflection moved, a slow, unnatural tilt of the head, its eyes too dark, its mouth curling into a smile I didn't make. Rule 3, if your reflection moves differently, leave immediately and don't turn around. My legs buckled, but I stumbled back, the door slamming behind me as I ran down the hallway, the flashlight's beam bouncing wildly. The dragging sound followed me, drag slosh, louder now, spilling from the auditorium into the lobby. I reached the candy counter, my chest heaving, and checked my phone, 2 a.m. The rule said to leave, but the front doors were locked, the keys in my pocket, and the note's warning burned in my mind, follow the rules, or it finds you. I couldn't run, not yet, not with that sound so close. The projector's hum faltered, the booth's light pulsing red again, casting the lobby in a bloody glow. The chandelier flickered, buzzed, flickered, the shadows twisting like they were alive. The dragging stopped, replaced by a low, wet scrape, scrape, right at the auditorium doors. I backed against the counter, the emergency kit rattling, and swept the flashlight's beam across the gap, now nearly 2 feet wide. A shadow flickered in the darkness, tall and thin, moving too fast to see clearly. My mouth went dry, my pulse a deafening roar. The rules weren't enough. The real wasn't enough. Whatever was in the auditorium was coming, and I was out of time. The shadow in the auditorium's gap vanished, but the wet, scraping sound, scrape, clawed through the silver screen's lobby, louder now, like it was scratching at the oak doors from the inside. I crouched behind the candy counter, my back pressed against the sticky glass, the flashlight's beam shaking across the widening gap, now nearly 2 feet wide. The SS 1947 reel's distorted hum droned from the projection booth, its grainy light flickering through the booth's window, casting a sickly red glow that pulsed like a wound. My phone read 2:05 a.m., and the rules in my pocket were a burning weight, their shaky cursive screaming, "Never speak to anyone in the theater after midnight. They are not patrons." My heart hammered, my breath shallow, as the memory of the women's room mirror, its wrong, smiling reflection, twisted in my gut. The lobby was a rotting mausoleum, its burgundy carpet sticky with decades of spilled soda and popcorn grease, crunching under my sneakers. The walls, streaked with water damage, pulsed under the chandelier's flickering light, the stains curling like fingers in the dimness. The air was thick, sour with mildew, wet earth, and that metallic tang that coated my throat, now so sharp it tasted like blood. The candy counter's glass reflected my face, pale, eyes hollow, sweat dripping down my temples despite the cold seeping through the locked front doors. The projector's red light throbbed, casting shadows that stretched across the lobby, bending unnaturally toward the auditorium doors. The scraping stopped, and for a moment, the only sound was the projector's hum and the chandelier's buzz, battling in the oppressive silence. Then it came, a voice, low and wet, like it was gargling mud. "Elliot." My name, spoken slow, deliberate, from the darkness beyond the doors. My blood froze. I hadn't told anyone my name, not Hargrove, not the patrons, not even the teens who'd laughed their way out after blood rot. Rule 6, never speak to anyone after midnight. I pressed my hands over my ears, my nails digging into my scalp, but the voice came again, clearer, closer. "Elliot." It wasn't human, too hollow, too stretched, like a recording played underwater. I clutched the flashlight, its beam trembling as I aimed it at the gap. The darkness beyond the doors seemed to ripple, like heat rising off pavement, but nothing moved, no shadow, no shape. The voice called again, "Elliot," now so close it felt like it was whispering against the wood. My stomach lurched. I slid lower behind the counter, my sneakers squeaking on the carpet, and pressed my back harder against the glass, the emergency kit rattling beside me. The SS 1947 reel's hum faltered, the booth's light pulsing faster, redder, like a heart about to burst. The chandelier flickered, plunged the lobby into darkness. For a split second, then buzzed back, its shadows clawing toward the doors. I checked my phone, 2:10 a.m. The night was a slow bleed, each second heavier than the last. The rules looped in my mind: stay in the lobby. Don't speak. Don't look inside. But the voice was relentless. Elliot, now joined by the scraping again, scrape scrape slosh, like something wet and heavy was dragging itself closer to the gap. I pictured the auditorium, rows of sagging velvet seats, the screen glowing with the reel's grainy static, the stage where the voice seemed to live, its hardwood slick with something I didn't want to imagine. I hadn't been inside, but the theater was forcing its image into my head, like it wanted me to see. I grabbed the cleaning spray from the counter, needing something to hold, something normal. The bottle's nozzle sputtered, spitting lemon-scented mist that did nothing to mask the wet earth smell flooding the lobby. I clutched it like a weapon, my other hand gripping the flashlight, its beam shaking across the faded posters, the shadows call, whispers in the dark, their red cursive titles pulsing like veins. The voice called again, Elliot, slower, almost mocking, and the scraping grew louder, scrape slosh, right at the doors now, like it was pressing against the gap. I wanted to scream, to shout back, to demand what it wanted, but Rule 6 stopped me. I bit my lip, tasting blood, and stayed silent, my eyes locked on the gap, now wide enough to see the stage's edge, its wood glinting under the reel's flickering light. A shadow flickered again, tall and thin, moving too fast to track, like it was pacing the stage. My pulse roared, my chest so tight I could barely breathe. The projector's hum stuttered, the red light pulsing faster, casting the lobby in a bloody haze. The chandelier buzzed, flickered, buzzed again, the shadows twisting like they were alive. I checked my phone, 2:15 a.m. The voice called again, Elliot, now so clear it sounded like it was in the lobby, inches from the counter. I slid to the floor, my back against the counter's base, and curled my knees to my chest, the flashlight pressed against my forehead. The scraping was relentless, scrape scrape slosh, and the doors creaked wider, the gap now nearly 3 feet, the darkness spilling out like ink. I wanted to run, to grab my backpack from the locker and sprint through the front doors, but the note from my locker burned in my mind: follow the rules, or it finds you. The voice stopped, but the scraping didn't, now joined by a low, wet gurgle, like something choking. I peeked over the counter, my flashlight's beam trembling across the gap, catching the edge of a seat, its velvet torn, stained dark. The gurgle grew louder, gurgle slosh, and the shadow moved again, slower this time, like it was turning toward the doors. I ducked back down, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. The rules weren't enough. The reel wasn't enough. Whatever was calling my name, whatever was dragging itself across the stage, was coming, and I was trapped behind the counter, waiting for it to find me. The wet gurgle, gurgle slosh, mixed with the relentless scrape scrape from the auditorium, clawing through the silver screen's lobby like a living thing. I crouched behind the candy counter, curled into a ball, my back pressed against the sticky glass, the flashlight's beam trembling in my hand, pointed uselessly at the floor. The auditorium door's gap was now 3 feet wide, the darkness beyond it pulsing, spilling out like black ink across the carpet. The SS 1947 reel's distorted hum droned from the projection booth, but it was faltering, stuttering, and the booth's window high above cast a blood-red light that throbbed like a dying heart. My phone read 2:20 a.m., and the rules in my pocket were a noose, their shaky cursive burning in my mind: keep the projector running on a blank reel. Never turn it off. The voice that had called my name, Elliot, wet and hollow, had stopped, but the silence was worse, heavy with the weight of whatever was waiting beyond those doors. The lobby was a decaying prison, its burgundy carpet sticky with decades of spilled soda and popcorn grease, crunching under my sneakers as I shifted. The walls, streaked with water damage, seemed to breathe under the chandelier's flickering light, the stains twisting like veins in the dimness. The air was thick, sour with mildew, wet earth, and that metallic tang that tasted like blood, now so strong it made my eyes water. The candy counter's glass reflected my face, pale, eyes sunken, sweat dripping down my cheeks despite the cold seeping through the locked front doors. The projector's red light pulsed faster, casting shadows that bent unnaturally, stretching toward the auditorium doors like claws reaching for prey. The gurgle returned, gurgle slosh, louder, closer, right at the gap now, like something was pressing against the doors, testing their give. Then, a new sound. A low, mechanical sputter from the projection booth. The hum faltered again, the red light dimming, then flaring brighter, so intense it bathed the lobby in crimson. My stomach twisted. Rule 1, never turn it off. I hadn't touched the projector, hadn't been near it since loading the SS 1947 reel, but it was failing, and the rules didn't say what to do if it broke on its own. The gurgle grew louder, gurgle scrape, and the doors creaked wider, the gap now nearly 4 feet, the darkness beyond it rippling like water. I peeked over the counter, my flashlight's beam shaking across the gap, catching the edge of the auditorium stage, its hardwood slick with something dark and wet. The shadow I'd seen before, tall, thin, too fast, flickered again, moving toward the gap, its outline blurred, like it wasn't fully there. My heart slammed against my ribs, my breath a ragged gasp. I ducked back down, pressing my forehead against my knees, the flashlight clutched to my chest. The projector sputtered again, a harsh clunk echoing from the booth, and the red light pulsed faster, like a heartbeat gone frantic. The chandelier buzzed, flickered, plunged the lobby into darkness for a heartbeat, then buzzed back, its shadows twisting like they were alive. I checked my phone, 2:30 a.m. The night was a slow death, each second heavier than the last. The rules looped in my mind: stay in the lobby. Don't speak. Keep the projector running. But the projector was failing, and the gurgle was closer, gurgle slosh scrape, now joined by a low, wet thud, like something heavy hitting the stage. I pictured the auditorium, rows of sagging velvet seats, the screen flickering with the reel's grainy static, the stage where the shadow moved, its wood stained with something I didn't want to name. The voice, Elliot, hadn't returned, but the silence between the gurgles felt like it was waiting, listening. I grabbed the cleaning spray from the counter, my hands shaking so badly the bottle slipped, clattering against the glass. I caught it, clutching it like a lifeline, and swept the flashlight's beam across the lobby, catching the faded posters, the shadows call, whispers in the dark, their red cursive titles pulsing like wounds. The projector's sputter grew louder, a grinding clunk-clunk that shook the booth's window, the red light flaring so bright it burned my eyes. The gurgle stopped, replaced by a heavy knock, thud, on the auditorium doors, then another, thud-thud, slow and deliberate, like a fist testing the wood. My mouth went dry, my pulse a deafening roar. I slid lower, my back against the counter's base, and checked the rules again, fumbling the paper from my pocket. The ink was smudged, the cursive trembling, but Rule 4 stood out: do not open the projection booth door between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m. It was past 2, and the projector was dying, but the thought of climbing those narrow stairs, of facing that red light again, made my chest tighten. The knocking grew louder, thud-thud-thud, the doors rattling in their frame, the gap now wide enough to see half the stage, its slick surface glinting under the reel's flickering light. The projector let out a sharp screech, the hum cutting out entirely, and the booth's light went dark, plunging the lobby into near blackness. The chandelier buzzed, flickered, barely holding on, its dim glow casting the lobby in a sickly yellow. The knocking stopped, and for a moment, there was nothing, just silence, thick and heavy, like the theater was holding its breath. Then the gurgle returned, gurgle slosh, louder, closer, right at the gap, and the shadow moved again, slow and deliberate, like it was stepping toward the doors. I whispered, "It's not real, it's not real," my voice barely audible, my nails digging into my palms. I checked my phone, 2:45 a.m. The projector was dead, the reel silent, and the rules were failing me. The knocking started again, faster, thud thud thud, the doors groaning, wood splintering at the edges. I clutched the flashlight. Its beam weak now, flickering like the chandelier. The gurgle was relentless, gurgle scrape slosh, and the shadow in the gap grew larger, its edges sharper, like it was solidifying. I wanted to run, to grab my backpack and sprint through the front doors, but the note from my locker burned in my mind, "Follow the rules, or it finds you." The projector was off, the doors were breaking, and whatever was coming was almost here. The auditorium doors groaned, splintering under the relentless thud thud thud, each blow shaking the silver screen's lobby like a heartbeat. I crouched behind the candy counter, my body curled tight, the flashlight's flickering beam barely cutting through the darkness left by the projector's failure. The booth's window, high above, was black, the SS 1947 reel silent, its distorted hum gone. The chandelier buzzed weakly, its yellow light stuttering, casting jagged shadows that clawed toward the door's gap, now nearly 5 feet wide, spilling an inky darkness that seemed to breathe. My phone read 2:50 a.m., and the rules in my pocket were useless, their shaky cursive a mocking echo, "Keep the projector running. Never turn it off." The projector was dead, and the wet gurgle slosh from the auditorium was louder, closer, joined by a heavy scrape, like something massive was dragging itself toward the gap. The lobby was a rotting tomb, its burgundy carpet sticky with decades of spilled soda and popcorn grease, crunching under my sneakers as I shifted. The walls, streaked with water damage, pulsed in the chandelier's failing light, the stains twisting like veins ready to burst. The air was thick, sour with mildew, wet earth, and that metallic tang that tasted like blood, now so sharp it burned my throat. The candy counter's glass reflected my face. Pale, eyes hollow, sweat streaming down my cheeks despite the cold seeping through the locked front doors. The knocking grew frantic, thud thud thud, wood cracking, the doors bowing inward, and the shadow in the gap, tall, thin, sharper now, moved closer, its edges solidifying, like it was stepping into the light. The gurgle was deafening, gurgle scrape slosh, right at the doors, so close I could hear the wet drip of something hitting the stage. My heart pounded, my chest so tight I could barely breathe. I clutched the flashlight, its beam flickering, nearly dead, and checked my phone, 3 a.m. 1 hour until lockup, but the rules were failing, the projector was off, and the voice, Elliot, wet and hollow, hadn't returned, but the shadow was there, moving, growing. I pictured the auditorium, rows of sagging velvet seats, the screen dark now, the stage slick with something black and wet, where the shadow loomed, its shape wrong, too long, too thin. The chandelier flickered, plunged the lobby into darkness, then buzzed back, weaker, its light barely reaching the counter. The knocking stopped, replaced by a low, wet crunch, like bones breaking under weight. My stomach lurched. I grabbed the keys from my pocket, their jagged edges cutting into my palm, and eyed the front doors, glass, locked, my only way out. The rules screamed in my mind, "Stay in the lobby. Don't speak. Don't look inside." But the doors were breaking, the shadow was coming, and the note from my locker burned, "Follow the rules, or it finds you." I couldn't stay. Not anymore. I stood, my legs shaking, and grabbed my backpack from the floor, slinging it over my shoulder. The gurgle slosh grew louder, now mixed with a low hiss, like air escaping a punctured lung. The doors creaked wider, the gap now wide enough to see half the auditorium, rows of seats, the stage glinting, the shadow moving, its head too low, its limbs too long. I bolted for the front doors, the keys slipping in my sweaty hands, the flashlight's beam bouncing wildly across the lobby. The crunch came again, followed by a heavy thud, like something had stepped through the gap, into the lobby. I reached the doors, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I dropped them. They clattered on the carpet, and I dove to grab them, my fingers scraping the sticky floor. The gurgle slosh was behind me now, in the lobby, inches away, the wet drip hitting the carpet. I didn't look back. Rule 3's warning about the mirror flashed in my mind, don't turn around. I snatched the keys, jammed one into the lock, and twisted. The lock clicked, the glass doors rattling as I pushed them open, cold October air hitting my face like a slap. I stumbled onto the sidewalk, the silver screen's neon sign buzzing above, half its letters dark, spelling S ver SEN. The gurgle slosh followed, fainter but still there, like it was just inside the doors. I sprinted to my car, parked a block away, my sneakers pounding the pavement, my backpack bouncing against my spine. The keys shook in my hand as I unlocked the car, threw myself inside, and slammed the door, locking it. My breath fogged the windows, my heart a deafening roar. I glanced at the theater, its glass doors closed now, the lobby dark, the chandelier's light gone. The shadow stood at the doors, tall and thin, its head tilted, watching me. I started the car, the engine coughing to life, and peeled out, the tires screeching. The silver screen shrank in my rearview mirror, its neon sign flickering, then dying. My phone read 3:10 a.m. I drove, hands gripping the wheel, my eyes darting to the mirror, half expecting the shadow to follow. The rules were in my pocket, the notes warning a scream in my mind, it finds you. I didn't stop until I reached my apartment, locking the door behind me, my breath ragged, my body shaking. The night was over, but the theater wasn't done with me. The silver screen theater's neon sign flickered in my rearview mirror, a dying beacon spelling S ver SEN as I sped away, my car's engine coughing in the cold October night. My hands gripped the wheel, knuckles white, my breath fogging the windshield as I swerved through empty streets, the memory of the shadow, tall, thin, head tilted, burned into my mind. It had stood at the glass doors, watching me, its shape too wrong, too long, as I'd fled the lobby at 3:10 a.m. The rules, still crumpled in my pocket, felt like a curse, their shaky cursive a constant scream, follow the rules, or it finds you. The wet gurgle slosh and splintering thud 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 of the auditorium doors echoed in my ears, even now, miles away. My phone, tossed on the passenger seat, glowed faintly, its clock ticking past 3:30 a.m. I reached my apartment, a crumbling one-bedroom on the edge of town, and fumbled with my keys, my hands still shaking from the silver screen's grip. The hallway was dim, the fluorescent lights buzzing like the theater's chandelier, casting shadows that seemed to shift when I blinked. I unlocked my door, slipped inside, and bolted it, double-checking the lock. My apartment smelled of stale coffee and unwashed laundry, a faint comfort against the theater's wet earth and blood stench. I dropped my backpack by the couch, the rules spilling from my pocket onto the floor, their yellowed paper curling like a dead leaf. I didn't pick them up. I didn't want to touch them. I sank onto the couch, my heart still pounding, and stared at the ceiling, its water stains eerily like the silver screen's walls. The rules had saved me, barely, but the shadow, the voice saying, "Elliot," in that wet, hollow tone, and the mirror's wrong reflection haunted me. I grabbed my phone, my fingers trembling, and dialed Hargrove's number, the one he'd scrawled on a scrap of paper during my orientation. It rang twice before he answered, his voice low, tired, like he'd been expecting me. "You made it out," he said, not a question. "I quit," I blurted, my voice cracking. "I'm done." "What the hell was that place?" A pause, then a sigh. "You followed the rules. Smart kid." His tone was flat, no surprise, no questions, like this was routine. "Don't come back. You don't need to know more." "Tell me what's in there," I demanded, my grip tightening on the phone. "What's with the rules? The real? The shadow?" He hung up, the line dead before I could push further. I stared at the phone, my pulse roaring, and threw it onto the couch. Hargrove knew something, but he wasn't talking, and I was too exhausted, too scared, to care. I leaned back, closing my eyes, trying to block out the memory of the gurgle slosh, the splintering doors, the shadow's tilted head. Sleep didn't come. Every creak of the apartment, every hum of the fridge, sounded like the theater, like it had followed me home. A week later, I drove past the silver screen, unable to stop myself. The marquee was dark, its letters gone, the neon sign dead. The glass doors were boarded up, closed permanently, sign taped crookedly to the plywood, its edges curling in the wind. The building looked smaller in daylight, its red awnings faded to pink, its gold trim chipped to gray. But it still felt alive, watching, the windows like eyes behind the boards. I didn't stop, didn't get out. I kept driving, my hands tight on the wheel, the rules still in my jacket pocket, unburned, untouched. That night, I found a ticket stub in my jacket, slipped into the inner pocket I never used. It was from Blood Rot, the silver screen's logo faded but legible, the date stamped, October 29, 2025. My hands shook as I turned it over. In the same shaky cursive as the rules, a new line was scrawled, "It's still finding you." My breath caught, my heart slamming against my ribs. I stumbled to the kitchen, lit a match, and burned the stub in the sink, watching the paper curl black, the smoke stinging my eyes. The words didn't vanish, they burned brighter in my mind. I lay in bed, the apartment dark, the street outside silent except for the occasional car. My eyes locked on the ceiling, tracing the water stains, waiting for sleep that wouldn't come. Then I heard it, a faint, wet drag slosh, slow and deliberate, coming from the hallway outside my door. My blood froze. I sat up, the bed springs creaking, and grabbed my phone, its light casting shadows that didn't match the room's angles. The sound grew louder, drag slosh, like something heavy and soaked was pulling itself along the floor, closer, closer. I clutched the phone, my thumb hovering over 911, but the rules warning stopped me, "It finds you." The door rattled, a soft thud, then another, thud, like a fist testing the wood. The drag slosh was right outside now, the air thick with that wet earth and blood smell, seeping under the door. A shadow flickered in the gap, tall and thin, its head tilted, just like at the theater. I backed against the wall, my breath shallow, my heart a deafening roar. The rules were gone, the real was gone, but the shadow wasn't. It had followed me, just as the note promised. The door creaked, splintering, and the last thing I saw was the shadow's hand, long and wrong, reaching through the gap, its fingers dripping black.